Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. Intro. Picture this. A 21-year-old guy is flipping eggs in his cramped New York apartment when the phone rings. He picks up, and through waves of static stretching across an ocean, a stranger's voice cuts through. "Barry," she says, "this is your Aunt Jane, in Nairobi. Listen, Barry, your father is dead. He is killed in a car accident." Click. The line goes dead. He sinks onto the couch, the smell of burning eggs drifting from the kitchen, trying to wrap his head around what he's just lost. But here's the thing. How do you grieve someone who was never really there? How do you mourn a ghost? His father had always been more myth than man. A collection of stories his mother and grandparents told. This brilliant, magnetic Kenyan scholar who disappeared when he was just 2 years old. The stories painted him as larger than life, a symbol of strength and principle, a vision of what a black man could become. But he was also an empty space, a hole, right at the center of a young man's life. Today, we're exploring one of the most raw and honest memoirs you'll ever encounter, Dreams from My Father, by Barack Obama. And here's what makes it so compelling. He wrote this long before anyone knew his name, before politics, before the White House. This isn't a campaign speech. It's something far more intimate. It's about a boy searching for his father, and through that search, discovering who he really is. It's about race, identity, and the baggage we inherit, whether we want it or not. By the time we're done here, you'll understand the deeply personal questions that shaped a future president, but more importantly, you'll have a roadmap for piecing together your own identity from the scattered fragments of family, history, and the dreams handed down to you. This is about finding where you belong, especially when you feel like you don't fit in anywhere. So what does a kid do when his father is more legend than reality? He listens. He collects the stories and holds them close. Growing up in Hawaii, young Barack Obama knew his father through polished anecdotes worn smooth by retelling. His father was this figure of immense strength and intellect. There was the story of him dangling a man over a cliff for disrespecting a gift, this fierce vision of justice. There was the one about him, the only African student at the University of Hawaii, showing up to a fancy awards ceremony in jeans and a leopard print shirt, the only time anyone saw him embarrassed. These stories created this image of a man who was brilliant, confident, and uncompromising. His father was black as pitch, his mother white as milk, but in laid-back Hawaii, this barely registered to the young boy. His father was a hero, a myth, practically a character from a creation story. But every myth has cracks, right? Questions that linger. The biggest one, why did he leave? And why didn't he come back? The stories never really answered that. They couldn't. They were designed to build a world for a boy, not explain the broken pieces. The official version went like this. His father won a scholarship to Harvard for his PhD, but couldn't afford to bring his new family along. They separated. He returned to Africa to fulfill his promise to the continent, and their love survived the distance. That was the story everyone agreed on. But as kids grow up, the world starts telling a different, messier version. For Barack, things started shifting when he and his mother moved to Indonesia. His mom had remarried an Indonesian man named Lolo, this kind and gentle guy who introduced him to a completely different world from comfortable Hawaii. A world of bustling markets, weird foods like snake meat and roasted grasshoppers, and poverty everywhere you looked. Then came the moment that shattered his childhood innocence. In a quiet library at the American Embassy in Jakarta, 9-year-old Barack was flipping through old Life magazines when he stumbled across a photo essay. It showed a black man in America who'd undergone chemical treatments to lighten his skin, hoping to find happiness by passing as white. The article explained that the results were permanent, and the man was filled with regret. Years later, he described it as a violent ambush. The knot in his stomach, the heat rising to his face. He desperately wanted to show the magazine to his mother, to her boss, to demand an explanation, but he said nothing. He'd discovered this hidden enemy, one that could reach him without anyone knowing, not even himself. That night, standing in front of the mirror, he wondered for the first time if something was wrong with him. That single photograph changed how he saw everything. He started noticing things he'd missed before. On the TV show I Spy, Bill Cosby never got the girl. In the Sears Christmas catalog his grandparents sent, Santa was white, and nobody looked like him. He was beginning to understand that the world had rules nobody had told him about, and that his mother's stories, full of love and hope, might be leaving things out. She tried to arm him with unshakable confidence. She brought home books on the civil rights movement, recordings of Mahalia Jackson, speeches by Dr. King. She told him that every black man was a Thurgood Marshall or a Sidney Poitier, that being black meant inheriting something great, a special destiny. But facing that magazine photo, her hopeful message felt fragile. His father's absence wasn't just personal anymore. It was tangled up in this larger, scarier question about race and belonging. When he turned 10, his mother decided he needed an American education. She sent him back to Hawaii to live with his grandparents. He enrolled at this prestigious prep school, Punahou Academy, a place of manicured lawns and opportunity. But for a kid fresh from the streets of Jakarta, it was a world of quiet alienation. On his first day, the other kids giggled at his name, Barack. One boy asked if his father ate people. He was an outsider, and during this time he learned one of the most painful lessons of his life. There was one other black kid in his grade, a girl named Coretta. They existed in separate bubbles, watching each other from a distance. One day during recess, she started playfully chasing him around the jungle gym. They were laughing, breathless, when they tumbled to the ground. Suddenly, other kids circled them, chanting, "Coretta has a boyfriend! Coretta has a boyfriend!" Panicked, desperate not to be linked to her, he stammered, "She's not my girlfriend." He stood up and gave her a slight shove. "Leave me alone!" he shouted. Coretta stared at him, her face showing disappointment and accusation. Then she ran off. It was an act of betrayal that haunted him. He'd been tested and failed. In that moment of choosing acceptance over loyalty, he'd trampled on part of himself. From that day on, he took refuge in America's consumer culture, watching TV and trying not to think too hard about who he was. Then one day, the myth became real. A telegram arrived. His father was coming for Christmas. For a month, the ghost he'd been wrestling with had flesh and blood. He was thinner than the stories suggested, with a slight limp from a bad car accident. He was charming and intelligent, and the family seemed to come alive around him. But he was also a stranger, and soon tension started building. One evening, his father told him to turn off the television, a Christmas special, and study instead. That command sparked a massive fight. His grandfather insisted it was his house. His grandmother said his father had no right to bully everyone after being gone for so long. In that fight, young Barack saw the cracks in the family story. He started counting the days until his father would leave. But before he left, something incredible happened. His father was invited to speak at his school. Barack was terrified. He'd been telling his classmates his father was an African prince, the son of a chief. Now he was sure all his lies would be exposed. His father stood before the class and began to speak. He talked about the Great Rift Valley, where humanity first appeared. He described the customs of the Luo, how a young boy had to kill a lion to prove his manhood. And he spoke of Kenya's struggle for freedom, of people who, like all people, longed for dignity and self-determination. He held the entire room captive. When he finished, kids applauded, bursting with questions. The boy who'd asked about cannibalism came up to Barack and said, "Your dad is pretty cool." In that moment, myth and man merged. His father was powerful not because he was a prince, but because his story was true and connected to something larger. For a brief moment, Barack felt pride and connection like he'd never known. Then, just as quickly, his father was gone again, leaving behind a few small gifts, some African records, and an even bigger void. The visit changed him. It made the search for identity more urgent. In high school, this search happened on the basketball court. Basketball was more than a game. It was a space where he could forge an identity. On the court, he found a community of other black guys who taught him an attitude beyond the sport. Respect came from what you did, not who your daddy was. You talked trash, but only if you could back it up, and you never let anyone see your hurt. It was also where he made his closest friends, both black and white. With his friend Ray, one of the few other black students at Punahou, he debated the complexities of their existence. Were the white and Asian girls who rejected them racist? Or did they just want someone who looked like their father? Was the basketball coach who didn't give him playing time biased? Or did he just prefer a different style? These conversations were a constant negotiation with the world. He learned to slip back and forth between his black and white worlds, a translator between two cultures, convinced that with enough effort, they'd eventually fit together. But a simple, frightening incident shattered that belief. At a party with some black friends, he brought along two white teammates, Jeff and Scott. His friends welcomed them, but they were clearly uncomfortable, huddled in a corner. After an hour, they asked to go home. In the car, Jeff said, "You know, man, that really taught me something. I can see how it must be tough for you and Ray sometimes, being the only black guys and all." Part of him wanted to punch his friend. In that moment, he saw a new map of the world, one that was suffocating. The world was playing on the white man's court, by the white man's rules. Even the kindness of a friend felt like confirmation of his otherness. The only thing you could choose was withdrawal into a coil of rage, until being black meant only knowing your own powerlessness, your own defeat. This revelation sent him searching for answers in books. He read Baldwin, Ellison, Hughes, and Du Bois, and on every page he found the same anguish, the same doubt, the same self-contempt. Only Malcolm X's autobiography seemed to offer a way out, with its message of self-creation and uncompromising respect. But even Malcolm's path felt closed to him. Malcolm wrote about wishing the white blood in him could be expelled. For Barack, that was impossible. He wondered what he'd be cutting off if he left his mother and grandparents at some imaginary border. This internal struggle led him into rebellion. Pot, booze, a little blow. He got high to flatten out the landscape of his heart, to blur the edges of his memory. It was a path toward becoming a tragic cliché, the young, lost black man, drowning in disillusionment. But something pulled him back. A conversation with his mother, who saw him slipping and feared he'd end up like his grandfather, a man of unfulfilled dreams. And then, his college years at Occidental in Columbia, where he tried to find identity in political activism. He got involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and for a moment, during a rally where he gave a fiery speech, he felt the connection he'd been searching for. He felt his voice returning. But that feeling was fleeting. His girlfriend at the time, a white woman he loved deeply, couldn't understand the anger he felt, the anger in the black art he showed her. After seeing an angry, funny play by a black playwright, she asked him why black people were so angry all the time. The fight that followed revealed an unbridgeable gap between their worlds. She told him she couldn't be black, she could only be herself. And he realized that if they stayed together, he'd have to live in her world, because he was the one who knew how to live as an outsider. He pushed her away. His friend Regina, a thoughtful and grounded black woman, gave him the sharpest critique. After his big rally speech, he confessed to her that it all felt like a farce, just a way to feel important. She looked him straight in the eye and told him his real problem. "You always think everything's about you," she said. "The rally is about you. The speech is about you. The hurt is always your hurt. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Obama. It's not just about you, it's about people who need your help." Her words hit him hard. He'd been so wrapped up in his own perceived injuries, his own search for belonging, that he'd forgotten the larger struggle. He realized he'd been running from fear. Fear that he didn't belong, that unless he hid and pretended, he'd forever be an outsider. Regina's words were a call to something bigger. It wasn't about finding a perfect identity for himself. It was about connecting his story to a community's story. This realization led him to Chicago. In 1983, with romantic, grainy images of the civil rights movement in his head, he decided to become a community organizer. It was a promise of redemption, a way to build the community he'd been searching for. He imagined himself organizing black folks at the grassroots for change. The reality was far from romantic. His new boss, a rumpled, cynical organizer named Marty Kaufman, told him that anger was a job requirement. "Well-adjusted people find more relaxing work," he said. Marty's philosophy was simple and unsentimental. Find out people's self-interest, organize them around concrete, winnable issues, and build power. His work took him to the far south side of Chicago, to communities hollowed out by the loss of steel mills and factories. He met people who'd achieved a fragile piece of the American dream, only to watch it crumble. He heard stories of white flight, decaying storefronts, and growing fear. His first big organizing effort was a disaster. A meeting he called to address gang violence drew only 13 people. The police commander he'd invited sent a low-level substitute. The whole thing felt like failure. He learned a hard lesson from Marty. Issues had to be concrete, specific, and winnable. He also learned about the complex and often bitter politics within the black community itself. When he tried to enlist local ministers' help, a powerful pastor, Reverend Smalls, shut him down. "We don't need nothing like this around here," Smalls told him, dismissing him as a high-talking, college-educated brother working for Jewish organizers and Catholic churches. But he found allies too. There was Will, the passionate deacon, who preached a social gospel and wasn't afraid to challenge middle-class complacency. There was Dr. Martha Collier, the tough, dedicated principal of an elementary school in the Altgeld Gardens housing project, who saw the light go out of children's eyes by the time they turned 10. And there were the parents from Altgeld, young mothers like Sadie, Linda, and Bernadette, trying to raise their kids between a sewage plant and a landfill. It was with them that he found his first real victory. After discovering that the Chicago Housing Authority knew about asbestos in the project, but hadn't told residents, they organized. They went downtown to CHA headquarters, and when officials refused to see them, they held an impromptu press conference. The publicity forced the CHA to act. On the bus ride back to Altgeld that day, surrounded by triumphant parents, He felt a contentment he'd never known. He'd helped people reclaim power they'd had all along. That bus ride, he said later, kept him going. But organizing was a world of one step forward, two steps back. A massive community meeting with the CHA director descended into chaos when a tug-of-war over a microphone made them look foolish on the evening news. The victory on asbestos turned bittersweet when they learned funds for the cleanup would come at the expense of other desperately needed repairs. He was learning the hard truths of change. It was slow, frustrating, and often heartbreaking. He also learned that beneath people's stated interests, wanting a stop sign or a repaired toilet, lay deeper stories. Sacred stories. Stories of terror and wonder. Sacrifice and disappointment. He began sharing his own story, and in that exchange, he started finding the sense of place and purpose he'd been looking for. Just as he was finding his footing, his world shook again. Harold Washington, Chicago's first black mayor and a symbol of collective hope, died suddenly of a heart attack. The coalition he'd built instantly shattered, and city politics reverted to bitter, racial factionalism. The dream seemed to die with him. During this period of doubt, he started thinking about leaving Chicago, about going to law school. Not to escape, he told himself, but to gain new tools, to learn power's currency, and bring it back where it was needed. But he was haunted by the fear that he was repeating his father's pattern, leaving his community behind for the allure of a world-class education, becoming a divided man, just like his father. Around this time, his half-sister Auma, whom he'd never met, called him from Germany. She was coming to visit. Her visit was a revelation. For the first time, he heard the other side of his father's story. The old man, as Auma called him, wasn't the simple hero of his childhood myths. She told him about a brilliant man who, after returning to Kenya with his Harvard education, had been blacklisted by the government for his outspoken criticism of tribalism and corruption. His career was ruined. He started drinking heavily. His life fell apart. He became a bitter, abusive husband and a distant, demanding father. Auma and his brother Roy grew up fearing him, living in poverty and shame. He was a man crushed by the weight of his own broken dreams. The image of his father he'd carried his whole life vanished. It was replaced by a real, flawed, tragic human being. He felt like he'd been wrestling with a ghost. Now that ghost was gone. This new, complicated understanding of his father made the final part of his journey necessary. He had to go to Kenya. He had to stand on the soil where his father was born and buried. He had to find the rest of his story. The trip to Kenya was a collision of worlds. He met aunts, uncles, cousins, and another brother, Bernard. He was welcomed with a warmth and unquestioning sense of belonging he'd never experienced. For the first time, his name, Obama, wasn't strange. It was a connection to a web of relationships, alliances, and grudges stretching back generations. But this feeling of belonging was complicated by the reality of poverty and the constant, unspoken demands of family. He was the American relative, the one with everything, a perception that created both a bond and a barrier. The climax of his journey happened in Alego, the small village where his father grew up and his grandmother Granny still lived. There, under a mango tree, as his grandmother braided Alma's hair, she told him their family story, going all the way back. She told him about his grandfather, Hussein Onyango, the man they called the Terror. He was stern, disciplined, and fiercely independent, a man who'd left his village as a boy to work for the British. He learned their ways, their hygiene, their farming techniques, but he never bent to their authority. He was arrested during the emergency, the Mau Mau Rebellion, and came back from the detention camp a broken man. and she told him, finally, the full story of his father. A brilliant, mischievous boy who could never forgive his own mother, Akumu, for abandoning him. A young man who was expelled from school, estranged from his father, and desperate to prove himself. A man whose life was saved by two American women who saw his potential and helped him get a scholarship to a university in a place called Hawaii. In her stories, he saw the patterns repeating, the same pride, the same fears, the same stubbornness passing from father to son. Standing before his father's and grandfather's graves, he finally understood. The pain he felt was his father's pain. His questions were his brother's questions. Their struggle was his birthright. He felt the circle finally close. Who he was, what he cared about, was no longer just words or ideas. His life in America, the black life, the white life, the abandonment, the hope, all of it was connected to this small plot of earth, an ocean away. The silence that had separated father from son, generation from generation, was what had betrayed them. He'd finally found his father, not in the myth, but in the messy, contradictory, and beautiful truth of his story. And in doing so, he'd finally come home. Dreams from My Father is a book that stays with you long after you've finished reading. It's a story that works on so many levels. On the surface, it's a search for a father, but it quickly becomes clear that the father represents something much larger, a history, a community, a sense of self. What I find so powerful about this journey is its honesty. Barack Obama doesn't give us easy answers. He doesn't present some romanticized version of his past or a sanitized version of his identity. Instead, he invites us into the confusion, the doubt, and the pain. He shows us the shame he felt as a boy pushing Coretta away, the anger and alienation of his teenage years, the moments of vanity and self-doubt as a young organizer. The central lesson, I believe, is that identity isn't something we're given. It's something we have to actively build. It's not found in a single place or a single story. It's pieced together from all the conflicting parts of our inheritance, the good and the bad, the proud and the painful. He couldn't choose between his white mother from Kansas and his black father from Kenya. He couldn't choose between the intellectual world of Columbia University and the grassroots struggles of Chicago's South Side. He had to find a way to hold it all. His journey teaches us that our roots don't have to be chains holding us back. They can be anchors giving us strength. But to find that strength, we have to look at our history honestly. When he first went to Kenya, he was looking for an idealized Africa, a promised land. What he found was far more complex, a place of beauty and hardship, of deep communal bonds and bitter family disputes. By confronting the difficult truths about his father, the alcoholism, the failed ambitions, the pain he caused, he didn't destroy the man. He found him. He replaced a one-dimensional myth with a three-dimensional human being, and in that act of understanding and forgiveness, he was able to forgive himself and find his own path. For anyone, but especially young people trying to figure out who they are, this story offers profound insight. Don't run from the complexity of your own story. Your identity isn't a problem to be solved, but a story to be told. And that story includes all of it, the parts you're proud of and the difficult parts. It's in embracing all those messy, contradictory details, as he calls them, that we find wholeness. So what can we take away from this? Here's a simple action you can take today. Find an older relative, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, and ask them for a story. Ask them about their parents, or where they grew up, or the hardest thing they ever went through. Don't just listen to the story. try to understand the world they lived in. In their memories, you might find a piece of your own story you didn't know was missing. You might find that the questions you're wrestling with are the same ones they faced. And you might discover that you're part of a longer, richer, more complex story than you ever imagined. That was a summary of Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. We've touched on the major themes and stories today, but I'll be honest, a summary is like looking at a photograph of a beautiful landscape. It can give you an idea of what's there, but it can never replace the feeling of actually standing in that place yourself. The real power of this book is in the journey it takes you on, in the quiet moments when Obama's search for meaning mirrors your own. This summary is meant to give you a glimpse of that journey. If any of the questions or struggles we've talked about today have resonated with you, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning the story of a famous man. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you see yourself, your family, and your place in the world. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe. It tells us we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book. Let's keep exploring and growing together.